Hello fellow Unreal Engine artists, designers and developers, and welcome to this latest episode of the Landscape Material series. In today's tutorial I'm going to show you how to add reflective water puddles to your landscape with various controls over the size, depth and look of those puddles. Let's get into it. Before we get going on today's episode, I need to fix an issue with the noise mask that we've been using for our snow and our colour variation, and that we'll also be using today for the puddles. I noticed that when we turned the snow noise amount up to 1, it actually got rid of most of the snow here, and I really wanted this mask to have mainly snow and just little gaps in it, and I realised the mistake was that the mask is in the wrong color space. So let's fix that quickly. If you go into your content browser and find in the materials textures, find the snow edge noise. In fact, let's rename this because we're using this for lots of different things. So I'm going to call it T landscape noise. And then if you open it up, the problem is that when I imported it, it thought it was a regular color mask and it applied this sRGB color space to it. And that's used for regular color textures and has slightly more of a curve at the bottom end. So if you take that off, you can see that it gets a lot lighter, and that will result in a lot more snow in our mask. So let's save that. And once we've saved it, we'll have to do a couple of changes in our material functions. So if you go into the material functions and choose the snow mask, you'll see that there is an error with the texture sample because it's no longer a color sampler type. It is now linear color. So save that. And we'll also have to do the same thing in our color variation function. So go back into material functions folder, color variation, find the texture here, and instead of color you'll need to choose linear color. So it's just a straight line used as a sort of a mathematical mask instead of a real color texture. And click on save there. Now if we go back to our landscape, you can see that there is a lot more snow being let through on the mask. The color variation will also be affected as well. It might be a bit darker or a bit lighter, so you can play around with those values as well. But it was really the snow that was bothering me because I wanted to obviously have these little gaps in the snow rather than large empty patches, and that's what the linear color has done for us. So with that out of the way, we can now move on to implementing our puddles functionality. So I want to allow the landscape designer to have the option to add puddles on this ground layer with control over the size, depth and look of the puddles. So we're going to create a new material function for that. And if you go into your material functions folder, we'll right click and do new material function. And we'll call this mf_puddles and open that up. And just like a lot of our other material functions, we'll have the material coming in for our layer, and then we'll have the affected material going out. So let's add a new input. We're going to call this input material, and it's going to be type material attributes, and our output will be called material with puddles. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to use the noise texture again to decide where the puddles appear, and then we're going to affect the roughness and specular attributes to make it more shiny and water-like in those areas where the noise mask shows through. So we've done the stuff like this before. In terms of the noise mask, we can right click and do a texture sample. We can choose our landscape noise that we've just been working on, and we need to specify the tiling size for this. So again, we've done this a few times before in this series. Landscape coordinates, do a divide, and plug that into the UVs, and then we'll set up a new parameter. Now, because I'm only going to use this on the ground layer, I don't have to set up inputs for everything. I'll set up the parameters directly within the function. So hit S and left click, and we'll call this puddle size, and we will plug that into the divide. So now we have control over the size of the puddles, and we'll do a default value of 100 here. Okay, and now what do we actually want this mask to control? Well, let's take our material attributes here and do a set material attributes, and then attach that to the output. And then within the set material attributes, let's pick two of our attributes, which is the specular and the roughness. So at the moment, we've set these so that our roughness is always a value of 1, which means fully rough, and our specular is always a value of 0. So effectively, we want this mask to change the roughness and specular wherever the masked areas are. And in order to do that, we can do a lerp node from the output of this texture sample. So we can choose the RGB or the red channel. It doesn't really matter for this. And let's do L for lerp and drag this out as the controlling mask for this, and then we want to lerp between two values. So let's do a, if the mask is off, then we want a roughness value of 1, fully rough, and if it's off, we want a value of 0, which is fully reflective. And then we're going to plug that into the roughness. So now where our puddles appear, we will have a fully reflective value, and where our puddles don't appear with a value of 0, we'll have a fully rough value, just as before. And the specular is the opposite way around. So all we need to do in order to reverse this is come out of here, type 1- to switch it around the other way, and plug that into the specular. So you now have that the opposite way around. So we ought to give this a quick test out. We need to put it into our master material, but let's give this puddle size a group of 1 ground and start with order 10 and save that. Go into our master material, and what we will do is in between the creation of the ground layer and the ground material reroute node, we will add that new function. So go into the material functions, drag the puddles function in, plug the ground material in, and the material with puddles comes out the other side. Save. And if you go back here, you can see that it is starting to look a little bit wet on here. And if you go to your material instance, we now have this new puddle size. So let's just slowly get closer to the ground level here. So you can change the puddle size. And it's looking okay, but what it's actually done at the moment is it's just applied sort of a dampness to the surface. It doesn't really look like reflective puddles, and that's because at the moment the normals are still staying the same where the water is. So we've still got the contours of these textures. What we really want to do is where the puddles appear, we want the normal to face directly up so that we've got a completely reflective plane there. So we need to add a little bit of extra code in our material function. Let's go back to the puddles here, and what we will do is from the input here we will do a get material attributes, and let's plug that into the set, and the material attribute we want to get is our normal value. And now we want this mask here to control when this normal goes through unaffected, or we have it just facing directly up. So let's move this down a little bit. Move this down a little bit as well. And what we need to do is we need to have an option that this is the normal as it is, and then we want another one which faces directly up. And so a normal that faces directly up is a color value with 1 on the blue or Z axis. So I'll hit 3 on the keyboard and select a vector 3 and set the Z value to 1. So that means that there's no effect on the X and Y axis, and it's just pointing directly up. And now we can use our mask to lerp between these two as well. So let's create another lerp node here. So plug our output into the alpha here. And if the mask is 0, we want the normal unaffected. If the mask is 1, we want the normal facing directly up. And then we need to rewrite the normal to the set material attribute. So in here, just duplicate this specular here and choose normal. And then what we'll do, in fact, let's move these around a bit. Let's have normal, roughness, and specular. And then let's just plug this one into specular. So it's in fact, let's just disconnect these. Right, so that's into roughness. That's into specular, turn around, and our normal comes out of the lerp and goes into normal. So now we have control over the normal direction from the mask as well. Click on save. Let's go back to our landscape, and you can see that now these, where the puddles are, they're perfectly flat and reflective, and you can see reflections of the mountains in them. So it's, we've got the control over the sort of size of the mask, but it would be useful to have a bit more control over restricting the sort of the way these puddles look in terms of the depth and the noise shape. So let's put in a couple of other controls over the mask shape. So go back to your puddles, and what we'll do is we will move this back slightly here, and we're going to now start doing a little bit more manipulation over the noise. So first thing I'm going to do is add in a power node. I'll explain what we're going to, why we're doing this in a minute, and we'll steal this parameter with Control D. I'm going to call this Puddle Constraint. We'll do a default value of 1, make it sort priority 11, and we'll plug that into the exponent here. And let's disconnect these alphas with Alt and reconnect them to the output of this. So what this does, the power does, imagine that this is a value between 0 and 1 here. If you have an exponent of 1, it's unaffected. If you have an exponent of 2, it means you're squaring the number, so half becomes a quarter, 1 stays unaffected. If you have an exponent of 3, half becomes 1/8. So what you're doing is you are constraining the lower end and making more darker values as this value goes up. So let's actually see this in action to see what it actually looks like. Click on save. So there shouldn't be any change at the moment because we've put in a puddle constraint of 1, which is unchanged. But as we up these values, so squared, you can see that now it has reduced the dark values so much that you're only seeing a little bit of the puddles here, and if you make it 3, they are almost disappeared for tiny little patches. So this is a way of constraining the amount of puddles you see on the landscape. What we'll do is we'll add another parameter now we've constrained it. What we can do is we can multiply it just to allow it's sort of like the perceived depth of the puddle. It will introduce a bit more of the mask. So let's leave that on 4, come back to our puddle function, and we will introduce a multiply. And we're going to put that into our alphas. We're going to steal the parameter here with Control D, and we're going to call this one Puddle Depth, because that's what it will seem like when we're doing the controls. Leave the default value of 1, make the sort priority 12, and plug that in here. And let's click on Save. Nothing should have changed here at the moment. But if we go to our parameters, where we now have depth, so the constraint here has reduced the amount of puddles we see. Now what we can do is we can start to have control over the depth of these puddles by multiplying it again. So you can see it's spreading it out a little bit there. So it's starting to look pretty good. We have plenty of control over size, how much we constrain the puddles and how deep they appear. I'm going to introduce one final control over here. At the moment you can see that these are fully reflective. They look like clear water. What we can do is we can use the metallic attribute of the material to change the reflection to actually reflect the color of the texture underneath, which is the way that metals work, and that will just make it appear darker on most ground surfaces. So let's go back to our puddles, and we will, in our set material attributes, we'll add one more attribute to set, and we'll call this metallic. Well, we won't call this metallic, we'll choose the metallic attribute. So by default our metallic attribute is 0. So what we're going to do is we're going to do another lerp using our mask. So let's just copy this with Control D, plug in our mask into the alpha channel, and if the mask is black, then we want our metallic value to be 0, and if our mask is 1, so it's on, we want a control over how dark it is or how metallic it is, so it'll be between 0 and 1. So we'll have a control for that. So let's copy the puddle depth, and we'll call this Puddle Darkness, and we will plug, and we'll have a value of a default value of 0, so we won't change it by default. So effectively it'll go between 0 and 0, nothing will change, and we can just move this over here and plug that into the metallic. We need to do a bit of tidying up here of some of these nodes, just so we don't get too much in the way of overlapping chords. But now we have a Puddle Darkness control as well. So let's save that and come back to the landscape here, and now you can see that there is we need to change the, come back here, we need to change the parameter to 13. Now we've got control over this. If we put the Puddle Darkness to 1, you can see that it looks like there's an oil spill here, so that's fully metallic, and that's probably too much, although if you are looking for an oil spill, that's quite a good effect. but let's put it down sort of halfway, and you can see that we are getting a sort of a nice darker, like dirtier water there. So still sort of reflective, but with a bit of dirt and darkness in it as well. Now I'm noticing that our normals aren't looking quite right on these puddles. It looks as though we're still having normal information here where we should have a flat surface, and I realized that in the material function I forgot to clamp the value after this multiply. So this texture sample was between 0 and 1, and this power kept things between 0 and 1, but now we're multiplying values over 1. We could have values higher than 1 here, and obviously a lerp, you want to have these be between 0 and 1. So all we need to do is we need to create a little bit of space here. Let's create a new node called saturate, which clamps it between 0 and 1, and we can now move this with control. We can move this output into here and plug that into the multiply. So that is constraining our value between 0 and 1, and we won't get this weird thing happening when the normals are greater than or the alpha is greater than 1 here. So that should fix the problem. If we save that and come back, yeah, you can see now that the values are perfectly clear here, and if you change values, so the fully dark landscape is looking oily but slick at the same time, whereas beforehand it was showing normal information. And we can do further constraints of the puddles and change the depth values as well. Okay, one final thing to do in our function is to have the ability to switch this whole puddle feature on or off. Again, we've done this before with our sort of static switches. So come back to here, and what we'll do is in the final, just before the output material here, we will create a static switch parameter, and we will call this add puddles, put it in the ground group, and I wanted this to appear as the first parameter in this group. So our puddle size was 10, so let's make add puddles 9, so it appears just before it. Default value is off. If it's true, then we want to take our material attributes from here. If it is false, we want to take the material attributes that come in and just pass them straight through with no effect whatsoever on them. So, sorry, that's the false path. So false and true from here. Okay, so you get that switch here with add puddles, true from our set material attributes and false coming from the input. Click on save. If we go back here, now we don't have any puddles on our landscape, and you can see that the parameters don't even show because they are earlier than this switch. If we switch this on and click on add puddles, we then have the puddle options all back here, and we can change things like the size, the constraint, depth of the puddles, and whether they're light or dark on the landscape or somewhere in between. So we have a lot of choice over how these puddles look and feel on the surface. So I hope you've found today's tutorial useful. In the next episode, we will have a look at doing something called triplanar projection. This will make the cliff faces less distorted when they're on steep slopes and have more even textures on those cliffs. So stay tuned for that one, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.